This morning's gospel reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 through 3 and 11b through 32. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
I had the terrible experience the other day of losing my wallet. Anybody ever lose their wallet? Yeah. Not fun, right? Here's the thing, I didn't even know I had lost it. I had gone to Walmart in North Tonawanda for lunch. I'd gotten a sub from Subway at the front of the store there. And I sat there and, sat at one of those high tables, and people watched and scrolled through my phone for a few minutes. And it's always interesting the kinds of people that come in and out of Walmart, during the lunch hour. Anyway, my chiropractor's been telling me not to sit on my wallet anymore because it's hurting my back. So I've been wearing my wallet, or putting my wallet in my front jacket pocket. And somehow when I was sitting there, it must have fallen out. I don't know how. But after I finished my lunch, I needed a few groceries, so I got up and started shopping. And about 10 minutes later, as I'm about to check out, I get this call from Samantha Miller. "Pastor Matt, you've lost your wallet." What? "It's at Subway. They found it." "Oh, okay." And I was confused, but I thanked her profusely, and I went back to the front of the store, and sure enough, they had it. Somehow it had fallen out of my jacket pocket, and they had found my name in it on the driver's license or something, and they must have Googled my name or something and come up with the St. James website, so thank you, Judy. Somehow it's searchable on there. And then they called the church and got Sam, and Sam called me. You know, it's amazing. It sounds like a long process, but with a couple of, you know, clicks through Google, it's easy. But I was very lucky because I opened up my wallet and everything was in there. So kind of a crazy story. Sometimes what's lost is found. I was very fortunate, as I said. But many times what lost isn't ever found, is it? Have you ever lost something and you had to go to the lost and found to look for it? Anybody ever been to a lost and found? Usually it's full of what? Junk. Nothing that you want, right? Like weird stuff, like old pacifiers. And, you know, somebody dropped something weird and now it's sitting there collecting dust. Usually if you lose something valuable, it's not going to be found on purpose, right? Or you find your wallet or your purse and it's
like the original version of this stuff.
One of the images I have for the church is like that of a lost and found. But unlike the typical lost and found, there are no forgotten people. There's no junk in Jesus' kingdom. Our passage from last week's lectionary about the parable of the fig tree tells us that there are no throwaway people in Jesus' kingdom. But this week, as we look at the lectionary, we get the parable of the prodigal son. And the prodigal son really zeroes in on this idea of being lost and found. How many people have some background with the story of the prodigal son? Anybody ever heard it before? Couple, three people? Okay. It may be one of Jesus' most well-known parables. And there are all kinds of books and well-known sermons that are preached on it, so I'm going to try to avoid covering the same old ground, but it's hard to do. The parable serves as really one of the main metaphors for entering into the Christian life, doesn't it? I rebelled, I went out on my own, I hit rock bottom, I found God, my life is turned around now, right? If you ask someone their testimony or of their conversion to Christian life, and it often has those kinds of themes in it. I think all of us, though, find our own story, at least a little bit, in this parable. Why? I think because we're all prodigal sons and daughters. At some point, all of us feel lost, out of our element, not sure where to go. And when it comes to seeing the church as a special and uniquely formed community, all of us were on our own at one time, but now we're here together, right here. It might be an odd combination of people. You might go, oh, I would have never picked this group of people to hang out with. But here we are, together. We're like the utility drawer that you might have at your kitchen or on your workbench. Anybody got a utility drawer? Some people call it the junk drawer. No? I don't care who you are, though. Everybody needs at least one utility drawer in the house. And maybe you have more than one. And some people call it a junk drawer, but it's not really junk, is it? Right? It's the stuff you can't throw away. Junk is stuff you can get rid of. But the stuff in your utility drawer is stuff that you know that at some point you're going to use it. Or at least you think you're going to use it, right? You're not sure when, but you know you should keep it. Maybe this is a bone of contention between husbands and wives sometimes. The church is a utility drawer for the community. It's a gathering, really, of odds and ends. Prodigal people. It's uniquely formed. There's no other community organization like the church because it's not formed from just people wanting to be together. When the church operates the way it's supposed to, it gets the benefit of seeing how God puts people together. And God puts people together in some really creative and unique ways. Because we're here for a mission, a purpose. We have an important purpose in our community. And it's not always clear to the people outside the walls what we're here for until crisis comes or until needs arise. And then suddenly, we're useful, we're helpful, we're there. People begin to understand why we're here, who we follow, and what we believe. when they see us in action. We act out God's love for people, for all people. And so in many ways, the story of the prodigal son, what does it do? It kind of circles back around, doesn't it? When we start living it out as Jesus followers, I once was lost, but now I'm found. And now I'm looking for other lost people who need to be found as well, so that they in turn can look for lost people who can find them. You can see how it goes on. The prodigal suddenly becomes the watching and welcoming father in the story, waiting for lost people as they find their way to God. That is, as long as the prodigal doesn't forget who she or he is, right? As long as the church doesn't forget who it is and what it is. That's the gist of the parable this morning. Because we can forget who we are. We can forget why we do what we do. And when we do that, the mission goes right out the window, doesn't it? So let's take a look at Luke this morning and see how it plays out. Well, first, you take a look at verses 1 and 2. Luke sets it up like this. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." The teachers of the law have forgotten who they are and where they came from. We're reminded of who they are and where they came from our Old Testament reading this morning. You might wonder, what is manna, the loss of manna and eating the produce of the land for the first time have to do with the story of the prodigal son? But let me read it to you and maybe you can figure it out. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food of the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites. But that year, they ate the produce of Canaan. For a whole generation, the children of Israel had wandered in the Sinai Peninsula, in the wilderness of the desert. Not a nice place to be. And God had to feed them every day with this mysterious manna from heaven, just so that they could survive there. God had to provide them with fresh sources of water. And we're told that they could have gone into the Promised Land much sooner, but they rebelled. They didn't trust God. They didn't trust that God knew what he was doing. And so this land where they celebrate the Passover in the passage had been promised to their ancestor Abraham, and again to Isaac, and again to Jacob. This was their inheritance, and they had squandered their opportunity to be there in a timely fashion. A whole generation had to come and go. They were a prodigal people, but they forgot about it, especially in the way that they treated each other. Because Jesus wasn't hanging out with just Gentile tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. He was hanging out with Jewish tax collectors and sinners. These are the Pharisees' own people. So this is really a family issue that Jesus is addressing. Jesus compares these teachers of the law to an older brother who sneers with jealousy when his younger brother repents and returns to the family. Remember the older brother in the story in verses 28 to 30. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours," notice he doesn't say my brother, "when this son of yours has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." Jesus is saying to these holy, pious men, you have forgotten who you are. You were once a prodigal people, lost in the wilderness. And you've forgotten what you're supposed to be about. You're not taking care of the lost members of your family who need your help and who need your kindness. And as a church, Jesus wants us to look out for prodigals, not to forget that once we were all prodigal people. Now, Jesus doesn't gloss over the fact that what the young son did was wrong. Being a prodigal means being basically a waster. Someone who squanders all that they have, trying to live in the moment of self-destructive glory. And not only that, but what does he do? He asks for his dad's inheritance. He asks for his inheritance from his dad while his dad's still alive, right? So basically he's saying what? Dad, you're dead to me. But what happens? Well, Jesus explains. If you look at verses 13 through 16, he says, "Not long after that, the young son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to feed to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." So he goes from being the it guy, right? I think of like those Instagram influencers, right? They're always taking pictures of them living their best life, right? Ever seen those folks? And he goes from the top to the lowest place possible, to a farmhand at a pig farm. Things are bad. He's literally down in the mud, isn't he? His life has really become a big metaphor for all the things that he's ever done to this point. And at some point, even if it takes hitting rock bottom, we know that we realize that we've gone the wrong way. The question is, when you realize that you've gone the wrong way, what do you do next? Do you let it motivate you to turn around and do something new? Or do you just persist and eventually drown in the mud? Well, for the guy in Jesus' story, it motivates him to change his life. If you look at verse 17, he says, "When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.'" So he came to his senses. He's like the Eagles song, Desperado, right? When will you come to your senses? Okay. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't. Maybe things at home aren't so bad. Maybe I should go back. I know I told my dad to drop dead, but well, he's a nice guy. Maybe he'll at least hire me as a servant. But things really don't go that way, do they, in the story? The father isn't really just merely a nice guy, is he? If there was ever an illustration of that verse from last week, Isaiah 55, where God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are higher than your ways," this really would be it. You know, we kind of misuse that verse a lot. We make God kind of harsh in that verse, but really, God is saying, I don't have limits like you have limits. God's thoughts are always on reconciliation and forgiveness. You know, we have our limits. We do. All of us have limits, right? Somebody can push you to your limits and you're like, fine, I've had enough. I'm washing my hands of you. I'm done. Right? We all have our limits. But God doesn't. The thing about God's love is that it never does let us go. It's always there. John Wesley had a term for it. If you're with my class today, what did John Wesley call the kind of love that never lets us go? Prevenient grace, right? Prevenient grace. You'll have to take my class if you want to know what prevenient grace is. But God's love never lets us go. And there's always a chance. It's always there on the chance that somebody might actually turn around toward God. And I think the same should be true for the church. You and I individually have breaking points. Again, enough is enough at some point, right? But when we work together, we become much stronger. We become much better at hanging in there for people and waiting, which is why God puts us together. The mission of the church would be exhausting. It would be impossible for us to do on our own. But when we can all specialize together, each of us doing what we're gifted to do, when we can all take our turn, we can have a break sometimes, when we can carry each other, guess what? We can carry this thing out. Together we can have the mentality of the father of the story. We can't do it by ourselves, but together we can watch and wait for prodigal sons and daughters to show up. God didn't keep score. He just wanted his son back. Again, individually, that would be impossible for you and I. We have our emotional and our financial limits of what we can bear. We can only do this if we work together as a family. Ministry to the world, a world of prodigal people, isn't for wimps, is it? If you've ever been in ministry very long, you find out that it's not. But our God gives us what we need, gives us the people we need, and gives us a model of love to aspire to. Because at this point, Jesus really shifts the story, doesn't he? It's not really on the younger son anymore. It's not on the older son. Really, who is this story about? It's about the Father. If you look at verses 20 through 24, Jesus really narrows in on the Father here. It says the younger son got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But this father's not having any of it, is he? Father called and said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. I think when I hear that passage, and maybe when you hear that passage, it calls for some kind of response, doesn't it? Just don't you want to just stand up and do something? Whatever it is, not sure what it is yet. I feel like that's the kind of business I want to be in, welcoming people who have made it, or are making, or want to make a change in their life. I want to be a witness and a participant to transforming lives. Those that have hit rock bottom of some kind, to the restoration in the family of God. I picture the church really in this role as almost like a cheering section, We're cheering people home. I want us not to be like the older brother. I don't ever want us to forget who we are or what our mission is. I want to make sure that it's always at the front and center of all that we do. Because as long as we keep Jesus in the front and center, it will never go wrong. Everything else can go wrong. But as long as we do that, we as a church, we as Jesus followers, will never go wrong. Like the other scripture passages we've been looking at in Lent this year, this is a scripture passage, I think, that calls us to tear things down. To peel back the layers of our lives and our churches, missions, and everything else, to see what's actually underneath of it all. To find out that if the things that we've built, the ministries, the buildings, everything else, are really serving the purpose that we've meant them for. And if they don't, well, then it's time to put something new in its place. That's what tearing things down does. It allows us to build new things. But to let Jesus make that determination, not our own desires. Lent is a time for reflection. So, reflect on these questions this week. Do you remember who you are? Jesus is calling on these religious leaders to remember who they are. Do you remember who you are? Do you remember why you do what you do? Are you part of a ministry or something specific in the church, or aren't you in a ministry? Why do you do what you do? And how about in the church? How often do we ask these questions? Do we serve God, or do we serve ourselves? And do our priorities say so? I want you to remember God's extravagant love for people. for all people, for you, for me, for all people, as you go about your ministry with all the people that you meet in your life. The bottom line of the prodigal son is that God will never be ashamed of us. God will never be ashamed to love us. So we can take encouragement from this. We don't ever have to be afraid.